My father gave my college fund to his new wife's daughter, expecting me to just walk away quietly. I always believed that a home was defined by the memories built within its walls, not the paperwork filed in a courthouse. But when my stepmother, Evelyn, stood in our sunlit kitchen and calmly explained that my presence was no longer required in the house my mother built, I learned how quickly a sanctuary can turn into a battlefield. For 3 years, I played the role of the quiet, accommodating stepdaughter, swallowing my grief and putting on a brave face for my father's sake. I watched them slowly erase every trace of my mother from the hallways, replacing her handmade quilts with modern, sterile decor. I thought that by staying silent, I was preserving the peace. Instead, I was just giving them permission to take everything. They thought I was an 18-year-old kid with nowhere to turn, completely blind to the trap they were setting. They were wrong. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed precisely at 6 o'clock, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the empty hallway. It was one of the few pieces of furniture that Evelyn hadn't managed to replace yet, mostly because it was too heavy for her to move on her own. I sat at the old oak dining table, running my fingers along a faint scratch in the wood, a remnant of a project my mother and I had worked on years ago. This house, a charming 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch, was supposed to be my safe haven. My mother had designed the layout herself, ensuring that the large windows always caught the afternoon sun. When she passed away 4 years ago, the light in this house seemed to dim, but the structure itself remained a physical tie to her memory. Then came Evelyn. My father met her at a real estate seminar just 18 months after my mother died. She arrived in our lives like a sudden, aggressive renovation project, bringing along her 17-year-old daughter, Chloe. Evelyn was a woman who spoke in a soft, modulated purr that managed to be incredibly demanding without ever raising its volume. She possessed a terrifying talent for making her worst intentions sound like acts of pure charity. Within 6 months of moving in, she had recarpeted the stairs, repainted the living room in a shade she called Alabaster Serenity, and relegated all of my mother's framed photographs to a dusty cardboard box in the attic. My father, Richard, was a man consumed by a quiet, lingering guilt. He couldn't handle the grief of losing his wife, so he chose to look forward by completely blinding himself to the present. He agreed with everything Evelyn suggested, nodding along like a passenger in his own life. If Evelyn suggested that Chloe needed the larger bedroom because of her spatial anxiety, my father would gently ask me to pack up my things and move across the hall to the smaller guest room. I complied every single time. I told myself that a room was just a room, and that making things easy for my father was the best way to honor my mother's memory. The real trouble began during the spring of my senior year of high school. I had received my acceptance letter from the state university, the very school my mother had attended. It came with a partial scholarship, but the remaining tuition and housing costs were supposed to be covered by the trust fund my maternal grandparents had set up for me. It wasn't a massive fortune, but it was exactly enough to ensure I could graduate debt-free. One Tuesday evening, the 4 of us sat down for dinner. Evelyn had prepared a meticulously presented roast chicken, though the portions always felt a bit sparse. The atmosphere was unusually tense, thick with an unspoken anticipation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Chloe kept glancing at her phone, a small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her lips, while my father refused to make direct eye contact with me, focusing entirely on cutting his meat. Evelyn cleared her throat, a delicate, practiced sound that usually preceded an announcement. She set her fork down and smoothed her linen napkin over her lap. She looked across the table at me, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that never quite reached her pupils. "Maya, darling," Evelyn began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your father and I have been reviewing the family finances for the upcoming year. With Chloe heading off to that private design academy in the city, and your own university plans, things are going to be incredibly tight. We've had to make some very mature executive decisions regarding the allocation of our resources." I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. "What kind of decisions, Evelyn?" My father coughed into his hand, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "What your stepmother is trying to say, Maya, is that we had to look at the big picture. Chloe's tuition is exceptionally high, and she doesn't qualify for financial aid. Since you have a partial scholarship and you've always been so independent and resourceful, we decided it was best to consolidate the educational funds." "Consolidate?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Dad, my college fund came from Mom's parents. It was specifically put aside for my education. It's not a general family pool." Evelyn gave a soft, patronizing sigh, leaning forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. "Maya, when your father and I married, we became a single, unified household. There is no yours and theirs anymore. We must support each other. Chloe's academy requires a massive upfront deposit, or she loses her spot. We used the funds from that account to secure her enrollment last week. It's what a real family does." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I looked at my father, waiting for him to contradict her, waiting for him to tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But he just stared down at his plate, his silence confirming everything. They hadn't just dipped dipped into the fund, they had completely emptied it. "You stole my money," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, devoid of the tears they probably expected. "That is a very harsh and ungrateful way to look at it," Evelyn replied, her tone sharpening just a fraction. "We are investing in this family's future. Furthermore, since you'll need to take out student loans now, we believe it's best for you to move out of the house by the end of the summer. Chloe will need your bedroom to set up her art studio for her weekend visits home. It's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet, Maya." I sat perfectly still, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. They had taken my mother's memory, they had taken my bedroom, and now they had taken my future, all while expecting me to smile and thank them for the privilege. They genuinely believed I had no recourse, that I was just a dependent teenager who would pack her bags and disappear into the night. What Evelyn and my father didn't know was that my maternal grandfather was a meticulous estate attorney who loathed shortcuts. When he set up that fund, he didn't just leave a bank account. He left a highly specific legal structure tied directly to the deed of the very house we were sitting in. I looked at Evelyn's smug face, then at my father's cowardly posture, and for the first time in years, the crushing grief inside me transformed into something sharp, cold, and calculated. The house grew profoundly quiet after midnight, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that settles over a place after a major confrontation. Down the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of my father's snoring, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just signed away his daughter's future. I stepped quietly out of my bedroom, avoiding the 3rd floorboard from the door that always creaked underfoot. Wrapping my sweater tightly around myself against the chill of the midnight air, I made my way to the pull-down ladder that led to the attic. The attic smelled of old dust, cedar, and dried lavender, the exact scent of my mother's old crafting room. Evelyn had banished everything that reminded her of the woman who came before her up here, creating a chaotic graveyard of my childhood memories. I navigated through the stacks of boxes until I found what I was looking for. A heavy, fireproof metal lockbox tucked beneath a pile of old winter coats. My grandfather had given it to my mother decades ago, and she had always kept the spare key hidden inside the hollow base of a porcelain music box that sat on the nearby shelf. My fingers trembled slightly as I retrieved the key, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. The mechanism gave a satisfying, heavy click. Inside were folders organized with legal precision. My grandfather Arthur had been a prominent estate attorney in our county for 40 years. He didn't believe in simple handshakes or vague verbal agreements. I pulled out the folder labeled Property Deed and Co-Ownership Agreement. As I flipped through the crisp, notarized pages, the legal realities of our living situation began to crystallize. Evelyn assumed that because she was married to my father, she automatically shared ownership of our family home. But my mother had purchased this house using her own independent inheritance before she ever met my father. According to the explicit terms of the deed and my mother's subsequent will, my father had only been granted a lifetime tenancy, a legal right to live in the house. The actual ownership of the property had been placed into a restricted trust, with 50% belonging to me immediately upon my 18th birthday, which had passed 2 weeks prior. Furthermore, a specific clause stated that if my father attempted to encumber, liquidate, or alter the core structural assets of the estate without the co-trustees' consent, or if he cohabitated with a non-lineal descendant who infringed upon the primary heir's residency, the lifetime tenancy could be challenged in probate court. But the real revelation lay in the financial addendum. The college fund they had so casually emptied wasn't a standard savings account. It was a custodial trust account linked directly to the property's equity as a protective measure. By withdrawing those funds for a non-beneficiary, Chloe, without my signature, my father hadn't just made a mature executive decision. He had committed a severe breach of fiduciary duty as a trustee. Evelyn had pushed him straight into a legal minefield. The next morning, I woke up early, packed my laptop, and drove straight to the law firm where my grandfather used to be a senior partner. One of his former junior associates, Mr. Henderson, was now managing the firm. He received me with a warm, sympathetic smile that quickly shifted into absolute professional fury as I laid out the bank statements, the deed, and the timeline of Evelyn's financial maneuvering. "Your father did what?" Mr. Henderson asked, his glasses slipping down his nose as he reviewed the unauthorized withdrawal slips I had printed from my online portal. "Maya, this account required dual authorization once you turned 18. Because the bank failed to update the milestone trigger correctly, your father was able to exploit an administrative oversight. But legally, that money belongs entirely to your educational expenses. And this house, Evelyn has absolutely no legal claim to it whatsoever." "I don't want to just stop them, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I want to ensure they can never take anything from me again. They want me out of the house by the end of the summer. I want to know what my options are right now." Mr. Henderson leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. If we file for a formal accounting of the trust and contest, the lifetime tenancy based on the breach of fiduciary duty, we can freeze all activity on the estate. Furthermore, as a 50% owner who is of legal age, you have the right to demand a partition sale, or alternatively, charge rent to any unauthorized occupants living on the property, like your stepmother and her daughter. I spent the next 3 hours working with Mr. Henderson to draft a formal legal notice. We weren't just going to file a lawsuit. We were going to deliver it in a way that ensured Evelyn couldn't twist the narrative or play the victim behind closed doors. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was buzzing with activity. Evelyn and Chloe were in the living room, surrounded by interior design magazines and fabric swatches. They were already planning the transformation of my bedroom into Chloe's new art studio. "Oh, Maya," Evelyn called out as I walked past the doorway, her voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing condescension. "We've booked the movers for the first weekend of August. We figured that gives you plenty of time to find a nice, affordable apartment near campus. Chloe needs the north-facing light in your room for her watercolor projects, you understand?" I stopped, holding the manila envelope tightly against my side. I looked at Chloe, who was smirking over a catalog of expensive drafting tables, and then at Evelyn, who looked entirely victorious. "I understand completely," I said, managing a polite, calm smile. "In fact, I've spent the whole morning making sure our family finances and living arrangements are properly sorted out for the autumn." Evelyn blinked, clearly surprised by my lack of resistance. "Well, how mature of you. I'm glad you're finally seeing reason." "Oh, I see things very clearly now," I replied quietly. "We're having a family meeting tonight when Dad gets home. I have some paperwork we all need to review together." The front door clicked open at exactly 6:30 and my father walked in, looking exhausted from his day at the office. He tossed his keys onto the entryway table, another piece of furniture Evelyn had bought to replace my mother's vintage console, and sighed heavily. Evelyn immediately glided out of the living room, greeting him with her characteristic, practiced warmth, while Chloe followed close behind. "Richard, darling, you're just in time," Evelyn murmured, guiding him toward the dining room. "Maya mentioned she has some paperwork for us to review regarding her moving arrangements. It's so wonderful to see her taking initiative." My father glanced at me, a brief flicker of relief crossing his face. He was likely thrilled that he wouldn't have to deal with a crying teenager or feel any lingering guilt about handing my education over to his new stepdaughter. "Excellent, Maya. I'm glad we can handle this like adults." They all sat down around the heavy oak table. I didn't say a word. I simply opened the manila envelope, pulled out the 3 distinct packets of legal documents Mr. Henderson had prepared, and slid them across the polished wood. One packet went to my father, one to Evelyn, and the third remained directly in front of me. Evelyn picked up the papers, her perfectly shaped eyebrows knitting together as her eyes scanned the formal header of Henderson and Associates, attorneys at law. "What is this? This doesn't look like a lease agreement for an apartment." "It isn't," I said, my voice steady, measured, and entirely devoid of emotion. "That is a formal petition for an accounting of the Arthur Vance Trust, alongside a notice of breach of fiduciary duty. And the document underneath it, Evelyn, is an immediate eviction and cease and desist notice addressed directly to you and Chloe." My father's face drained of color. He dropped the papers onto the table as if they had burned his fingers. "Maya, what on earth are you doing? This is completely unacceptable." "What's unacceptable, Dad, is that you committed a major financial crime," I replied, leaning forward and looking him dead in the eye. "You withdrew $42,000 from a custodial trust account linked to my name and my grandfather's estate without my authorization. You bypassed the administrative milestone trigger because the bank made an error. But legally, that money is entirely mine. Mr. Henderson has already flagged the transaction with the bank's fraud division and the probate court." Evelyn's soft, purring demeanor vanished in an instant. Her face contorted into an expression of pure rage, her teeth clenched as she glared at me. "You ungrateful little brat, we are a family. Your father had every right to use those funds to support this household. You live under our roof." "Actually, Evelyn, that's where you're fundamentally mistaken," I said, tapping the second set of documents. "You see, you never bothered to look at the deed of this house. You assumed that marrying my father gave you a stake in this property. But this house was bought entirely by my mother before she ever met him. Her will left my father a lifetime tenancy. Right to live here, but 50% of the actual ownership transferred directly to me on my 18th birthday 2 weeks ago." Chloe looked back and forth between her mother and me, her smug smile completely gone, replaced by a sudden creeping panic. "Mom, what is she talking about?" "Furthermore," I continued, ignoring the interruption, "the terms of my mother's trust state that if the lifetime tenant brings an unauthorized occupant into the home who infringes upon the primary heir's residency, like trying to force me out of my own bedroom to build an art studio, the lifetime. Tenancy can be legally revoked due to a material breach of the trust's conditions. Mr. Henderson is filing the paperwork tomorrow morning to strip Dad of his tenancy. My father looked like he was about to faint. Maya, please, you can't do this. Where would we go? This is my home. You can stay, Dad, for now, I said calmly. The eviction notice is strictly for Evelyn and Chloe. As a 50% property owner, I have never legally consented to them residing here permanently. Since they have actively contributed to the misappropriation of my educational funds, I am exercising my right to deny them access to the property. They have exactly 30 days to pack their things and vacate the premises. Evelyn slammed her hand down on the table, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. You can't just throw us out. Richard, tell her. Do something. But my father just sat there, his head in his hands, staring at the absolute disaster his cowardice had created. He knew my grandfather. He knew Mr. Henderson. He knew that every single word I was saying was backed by ironclad law. If you don't want to vacate, I added, looking up at Evelyn with a polite smile. Mr. Henderson has outlined an alternative option on page 4. You can choose to pay me retroactive rent for the past 3 years of occupancy, plus a 50% market rate rental fee moving forward to offset the $42,000 you stole from my college fund. And if that money isn't returned to my account by the end of the month, we will be moving forward with criminal charges for fiduciary fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Chloe began to cry quietly, realizing that her expensive design academy tuition was about to vanish into legal fees. Evelyn stood frozen, her face a mask of thwarted ambition and utter shock. She had spent 3 years systematically erasing my mother from this house, confident that she had won. She never imagined that the quiet, compliant girl she tried to destroy was the one who held all the cards. I stood up, neatly stacking my copies of the documents. I looked at my father, who couldn't even look me in the eye, and then at the 2 women who had tried to make me homeless in my own sanctuary. 30 days, Evelyn, I said quietly, picking up my envelope. I suggest you start looking for a nice, affordable apartment. I hear the north-facing light in the city is lovely this time of year. With that, I turned around and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to face the cold, unyielding reality of the consequences they had brought upon themselves.